Right, good morning everyone. Welcome back to the channel. You're all doing great. Today, as you can see, I'm here at my local beach, and together we're going to look at my 7 tips to improve your long exposure and minimalist photography. So let's get started. Alright, so let's start with the first tip, and the first tip is choose the right weather. In my opinion, you can basically shoot long exposure photography and minimalist photography with any weather conditions, but there are some conditions that I actually prefer. Basically 2 or 3. The one that I absolutely prefer is really dark conditions, so stormy clouds, rainy clouds, really dark skies and thick clouds. And when you have those conditions, you can get really dramatic images and really dark images, which is what I tend to prefer in my photography. Another type of conditions that I really like actually is blue skies, believe it or not. So days like today with absolutely no clouds and blue skies, you can get pretty creative with long exposures, and even with just minimalist photography in general, you can get really nice high key images if you expose right and you edit your images in a high key tone. Also, other types of weather conditions that I like are foggy conditions and of course snowy conditions, because if you have snow and if you have fog, those conditions really help eliminate all the distractions in your images, and the viewer can just focus on the main subject of your composition. So yes, my general advice is just shoot in any conditions, but just keep in mind that depending on the conditions, you're gonna get a different type of final image. Right, so tip number 2 is pre-visualization. And pre-visualizing your images before taking them is really important in any type of photography, but especially with long exposures, because as the name says, it takes a lot of time to take the images. So I find it really important to look at the scene before taking the image and just see how everything moves within the frame. So look at the clouds movement, look at the waves movement if you're shooting a seascape, and basically look at how all those elements in your frame move, and try to imagine how those movements are going to translate into a long exposure, so you can get an idea of the final image. I also find that using the crop tool in the camera really helps. So most of our images are square images, so I always use the square crop in camera to pre-visualize how the image is going to look like. And also I find that using the black and white film simulation in camera also helps removing the color distractions and basically reduce all the scene to shapes and lines, so you can have a better idea of how that image is going to look like in a minimal way. Tip number 3 is really simple, and it's just avoid busy scenes. So depending on what type of long exposure photography you're doing, this might or might not be true. But if you're shooting something like I do, so minimal photography, most of the times the grand vistas and the bigger scenes don't work well, but really simple elements, sometimes just single elements or no elements at all, are the best conditions for my type of photography. So maybe just a single rock or a piece of wood on the beach, or just nothing, just sand and water, can make for really interesting minimalist images. So yeah, maybe you're going to a trip in a location that you've never been before, and the first thing that you want to do is shooting the super wide grand vista that everyone else is shooting. But most of the times you just find out afterwards that no matter how you try, that composition doesn't work really well as a minimal composition. So yeah, try to avoid the big vistas and just focus on small elements. And most of the times you can just do that by using your eyes and looking at the scene and selecting the elements that you want to shoot. And sometimes just zooming in with your lens, it's enough to get rid of all the distractions. So yeah, no busy scenes, and it's also fun because like a place like this, there's nothing, and you can come 100 times and you will always find a minimal composition which is completely new and that no one else has ever shot before. Alright, so tip number 4 is use negative space. And in photography we have so many rules. The most common one is the rule of thirds, or someone might tell you never put the main subject of your image in the middle of the frame. We have so many of those rules, and those rules are fine as long as you know that you can actually break them. And sometimes with minimal photography and long exposure photography, it's actually a good idea to break those rules. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to use negative space. So for example, in your composition you can use elements like a clear sky with no clouds, or snow, a bank of snow. You can use shadows, you can use fog, you can use really any element in your frame to fill the frame in a composition that might seem odd but actually balances the main subject within your frame. And that really is the key to long exposure photography and minimalist photography in general. It's balance. So as long as you can achieve that balance, it doesn't really matter if you're adhering to those rules or not. So yeah, break the rules and embrace negative space. Alright, on to tip number 5, and tip number 5 is choose the best gear that you can. You can do long exposure photography with basically any camera that has a bulb mode. You just need a few items, but I think it's important to pick the right items to get the best results from the start in long exposure photography. So what are you going to need? You're going to need a camera, of course, and I suggest you to get a camera that can handle long exposure noise well, because what you want to do with your camera is to turn off the long exposure noise reduction in camera, because that doubles the exposure time. So for example, if you're taking 1 minute exposure, every time you have to wait another minute for the camera to process the dark frame and subtract the noise from your image. So you double the time, and if you take a lot of long exposures, that can be really hard to wait. So get the best camera that you can that can handle long exposures. So for example, my Nikon D850 is amazing. Every Nikon is actually really good at handling long exposure noise. As far as I know, Fujifilm cameras are not so good. Sony cameras, and Canon cameras, I really don't have any experience, so I can't really say. But just do some research and try to get a camera that can handle long exposure really well, because that will save you a lot of time in post-processing. Next thing that you're gonna need, and it's actually the most important thing that you're gonna need, it's the best tripod that you can get. So obviously this one is not the best tripod you can get. It's a really old tripod, but it's quite sturdy, and that's really the important thing, because long exposures, as you know, are long. So every time you take an image, it might take 30 seconds, it might take a minute, it might take 10 minutes, and all the vibrations that you get on your camera, all the vibrations from the wind, basically any type of vibration that you get, it can really ruin your image. So if your tripod is not sturdy, you're gonna have a really hard time shooting long exposures. So that's my recommendation. If you have money to spend on equipment, spend them on the tripod. So the next item we're gonna look at is ND filters, and you basically need those to get exposures that are longer than, a couple of seconds, unless you're shooting only at night. So you need to drag the shutter for 30 seconds, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Even in daylight you are going to need ND filters. And when you talk ND filters, there are really so many options. There are screw-in filters, square filters, magnetic filters. There's really a lot of choice out there. Personally, I use Nisi square filters, so it's the Nisi system, which I really like. I have used screw-in filters in the past, and sometimes I still do. I think there is a place and a time for each type of filter, and maybe we can talk about it in another video. But basically, the only thing that you have to look out for when you buy filters, especially if you shoot in color, is avoid cheap filters, because usually cheap filters can give you pretty hard color casts, so that's difficult to fix in post-production. And yeah, so ND filters, get whatever you can, just spend a little bit of money so you get something good. And then the final item that you really need is a shutter release, because with most of the cameras, if you want to go above 30 seconds for your exposure, you are going to need a release. You cannot do that in camera. So the release is actually not so important. I mean, as long as it works, it's fine. So any cheap release cable that you can get on eBay or Amazon works absolutely fine. What I think it's important is probably not to get the best remote that you can, but to actually get two of them, because most of the times those cheap ones just break, or maybe they stop working for some reason, or the batteries die. So it's always good to have another one in your bag just in case. So a couple of remotes, it's not going to cost you a lot of money, and that really saves the day. Okay, so that will be all for equipment. On to tip number 6, and tip number 6 is double check your settings. And this might seem really stupid, but it's probably the biggest reason why you miss out on some shots, or at least I do. So always check your settings before actually taking the shot, especially if you're shooting long exposure, because long exposures take time. So I think the most important things to check are actually 4 in your settings. The first one would be always make sure that you're shooting in manual focus, because every time you put your ND filters on the front of the lens, if the camera is still in autofocus, it will try to focus, and it won't be able to focus if you're using ND filters, so it's gonna hunt, and it's probably never gonna take the shot. The second one, which applies to people using, like me, a DSLR, is remember to always close your eyepiece before taking the shot. So if you're lucky enough to have a camera like the one that I do, like this Nikon D850, actually has a nice system to close the eyepiece, so you don't get any light leaks. But if you don't, and your camera doesn't have that system, make sure to cover the eyepiece with some kind of, I don't know, with tape, or maybe with a black t-shirt or whatever. It's really important that you don't get light leaks in your camera when you're taking a long exposure, because those light leaks will eventually end up in your image. Yeah, of course, if you're using a mirrorless, your eyepiece is just an LCD screen, so this doesn't apply to you. Another one is just double check, triple check that your tripod is not moving, that your tripod is really stable, in a good position, and that your camera, the horizon is straight and level. Because of course you can fix that afterwards in Photoshop, but it's always good practice to have your camera leveled before taking the shot. And finally, and again, this is really stupid, but it saved me many times to actually check that. If your battery is almost dead, remember to change it, because sometimes maybe the light is changing really fast and you want to really take that 5-minute sunset exposure, but your battery is low, so you do it anyway, and your battery ends up dying in the middle of the shot, and you lose the light and you lose the image. So it's always good practice to just put a fresh battery in, before taking the shot, so you are sure that you're gonna get it. Yeah, that's all. I mean, stupid things, but if you try to remember those, they're really gonna help you. Alright, tip number 7, final tip, which is double check your focus and your exposure after the fact. And this is really important because you spent a lot of time shooting your long exposure photography, and the last thing you want is for the image not to be sharp. And especially with long exposure photography, every small camera shake is gonna really affect the sharpness of your image. So it's always a good practice after you took the shot to play it back on the back of your screen on the camera and zoom in at 100% and check that at least the main subject is in focus. And another thing that I find really useful to do after I took the image is to check exposure, because of course even with normal photography, if an image is severely underexposed and you try to recover the exposure in Photoshop, you get noise. But with long exposure photography, on top of that you get also the long exposure noise, so you end up with a really noisy image, and you want to make sure that your image is exposed properly. So to do that, to check the exposure, never trust your eyes, never trust your LCD screen in a camera. The thing that you can trust the most in your camera is the histogram. So just take the histogram and make sure that nothing is crushed in your shadows and your highlights are not too bright. And then you're sure that you can get something really good to work with in Photoshop. Alright, these were my 7 tips to improve your long exposure and minimalist photography. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, remember to give it a like, it really helps the channel, and consider subscribing. And as usual, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.